I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something scraping against my truck. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate, something that made my blood turn to ice before I even opened my eyes. My name is Michael and I'm 41 years old. I've spent the last 15 years working as a petroleum engineer, traveling across the deserts of West Texas for remote drilling operations. I've seen dust storms that could strip paint off metal, rattlesnakes as thick as my forearm, and heat that makes the horizon dance like water. I thought I'd seen everything this desert had to offer. I was wrong. 3 weeks ago, my supervisor sent me to inspect an abandoned drilling site near the Big Bend region, about 40 miles from the nearest town. The company had reports of equipment vandalism, and they needed someone to assess the damage and secure the site. It was supposed to be a 2-day job. I packed my gear, loaded up my pickup, and headed out on a Tuesday morning, the sun already beating down mercilessly by 9 a.m. The drive took me deeper into territory I'd never explored. The road deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to little more than tire tracks in the sand. Cell service disappeared after the first hour. By the time I reached the site in the late afternoon, I was completely alone in a landscape of red rock formations, scattered creosote bushes, and endless sky. The drilling site was worse than I expected. Equipment had been torn apart, not with tools but with what looked like incredible force. Metal panels were ripped and bent, cables shredded, and the small equipment shed had been completely demolished. As I walked through the wreckage, something caught my eye in the dust near what remained of the shed's foundation. Tracks, but not like any I'd ever seen. They were massive, easily twice the size of my hand, with distinct claw marks that dug deep into the hardened earth. The stride between prints was impossibly long, suggesting something that moved with powerful bounding steps. I've tracked deer and coyotes across this desert before. These prints belonged to neither. They were fresh too, the edges sharp and undisturbed by wind. I pulled out my camera to document the damage for my report, but as I photographed the destroyed equipment, an uncomfortable sensation crept over me. That feeling you get when you're being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the rocky outcroppings that surrounded the site on 3 sides. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind across stone. I decided to camp at the site that night rather than risk driving back in darkness over those terrible roads. I'd done it dozens of times before at other locations. I set up my tent near my truck, started a small propane stove for dinner, and settled in as the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and purple before dropping below the horizon like a stone. That's when the howling started. It wasn't like coyotes. I've heard coyotes every week for 15 years. Their yipping chorus that sounds almost like laughter. This was different. Lower, longer. It resonated in my chest and made my hands shake as I gripped my flashlight. The sound came from somewhere in the rocks to the north, echoing off the canyon wall so I couldn't pinpoint its exact location. I told myself it was just an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe a mountain lion, though I'd never heard one make a sound like that. I locked myself in my truck, leaving the tent standing empty, and tried to sleep sitting up in the driver's seat with my door secured. The scraping sound came around 3 a.m. Something was moving around my truck. Slowly, deliberately. I could hear claws dragging across the metal, a sound that set my teeth on edge. My flashlight lay on the passenger seat, but I was terrified to turn it on, terrified of what I might see in its beam. I sat frozen, barely breathing, as whatever was out there circled my vehicle. Then it stopped. Right outside my window, I could hear breathing. Heavy, labored breaths that fogged the glass inches from my face. In the faint starlight, I could make out a shape. Tall? Far too tall. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but the silhouette was all wrong. The head was elongated, the shoulders massive and hunched, and then it pressed closer to the window, and I saw its eyes. They reflected the moonlight like an animal's, but they held something else. Intelligence, hunger, intent. I fumbled for my keys and started the truck. The engine roared to life, and the thing outside released a sound that I can only describe as a scream mixed with a snarl. It slammed against the driver's side door with such force that the entire truck rocked. I threw the vehicle into gear and stomped on the gas, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finally catching traction. As I accelerated away from the site, my headlights swept across the landscape, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing where my truck had been, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur, with a wolf-like head but a body that was grotesquely humanoid. Its front limbs were too long, ending in hands with extended fingers tipped with curved claws. And its face was twisted into an expression of rage, mouth open to reveal rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. I drove like a madman across that desert, the truck bouncing violently over the rough terrain. I kept checking my mirrors, terrified I'd see it chasing me, but there was only darkness behind me. After 20 minutes of reckless driving, I forced myself to slow down before I rolled the vehicle. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't make it far. About 5 miles from the drilling site, my truck hit a hidden wash in the darkness and the front axle snapped with a sickening crack. The vehicle lurched to a stop, front end buried in the sand at an angle. I tried to reverse out, but the wheels just spun uselessly. I was stuck, and I was still miles from any paved road, let alone help. I sat in the dead truck as the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, weighing my options. I had water, some food, a first aid kit, and my phone that showed no signal. I could try to walk out at first light, but the thought of being on foot in that desert with that thing somewhere behind me made my stomach turn. As the sun rose, I convinced myself I'd panicked over nothing. Maybe it was just a bear. We were close enough to the mountains. Maybe the isolation and the strange tracks had made my imagination run wild. I'd seen a large animal in the dark and my brain had filled in the terrifying details. I spent that morning trying to repair the truck, but the damage was too severe. The axle was completely broken. I was going to have to walk out. I loaded a backpack with water, a bit of food, my knife, and started hiking east toward where I knew the main road lay, maybe 15 miles distant. The temperature climbed rapidly. By noon, it was over 100 degrees, and I was rationing my water carefully. The landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a maze of identical-looking ravines and rock formations. I kept my eyes on the compass app on my phone, using it while the battery lasted. I found the cave around 3 p.m., when I was desperately seeking shade to wait out the worst of the afternoon heat. It was set into a rocky hillside, the entrance partially hidden by a fallen boulder. Inside, it was blissfully cool and extended back about 30 feet before narrowing to impassability. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered across the cave floor, and they were recent. Some still had scraps of dried flesh clinging to them. I recognized a rib cage that might have been from a deer, but there were others I couldn't identify. And on the walls, scratch marks. Hundreds of them. Deep gouges in the rock. This was its den. I backed out of the cave quickly, my heart hammering. I needed to keep moving to get as far from this place as possible. But as I emerged into the brutal afternoon sun, I heard that howl again. Closer this time, much closer. And it was answered by another howl from a different direction. There was more than one. I ran. I know you're not supposed to run from predators, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to move. I scrambled down the hillside, loose rocks sliding under my boots, and sprinted across the desert floor toward a cluster of larger boulders that might offer some protection. I made it to the rocks and wedged myself into a gap between two massive stones, trying to control my breathing so I could listen. For several minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard movement, the soft pad of footsteps on sand. They were hunting me. I stayed frozen in that crevice as the sun crept across the skin. I could hear them circling, sometimes close enough that I could smell them, a rank odor of decay and wild musk. They didn't rush in. They were patient, intelligent. They knew I was there, and they were testing my hiding spot, looking for a way in. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and I began to shiver in my sweat-soaked clothes. I couldn't stay there indefinitely. No food, limited water, and they clearly weren't leaving. I had to make a move. Around midnight, when the moon was high and full, I decided to try to slip away while they were less active. I'd noticed the sounds had diminished in the last hour. Maybe they'd moved on to hunt easier prey. I squeezed out of my hiding spot and started moving as quietly as possible between the rocks. I made it about 100 yards before I heard the snarl behind me. I spun around, and it was there, emerging from the shadows between two boulders. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly, and my mind tried desperately to deny what my eyes were showing me. It was covered in black fur that seemed to absorb the light, making it look like a moving void. Its legs were bent backward like a wolf's, but it stood upright, balanced on feet that were an unholy hybrid of paw and human foot. The arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, each hand sporting claws that had to be 4 inches long. And its head, that terrible head, with the elongated snout filled with teeth and those reflective eyes that stared at me with calculating intelligence. It didn't charge immediately. It watched me. And then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that communicated pure malevolence. I pulled out my knife, that small blade completely inadequate against what was standing before me. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, showing even more of those dagger-like teeth. Then it lunged. I dove sideways, purely on instinct, and felt claws rake across my backpack, shredding it open. My water bottles tumbled out, and I scrambled away, abandoning my supplies. The creature was faster than anything that size should be. It spun with inhuman speed and came at me again. I ran blindly into the darkness, no longer caring about direction or obstacles. I heard it behind me, sometimes close enough that I could hear its labored breathing, sometimes falling back as if it was toying with me. Rocks tore at my clothes and skin as I crashed through the desert landscape, completely disoriented. I fell into the ravine by accident, tumbling down a steep embankment and landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through my left ankle, and I knew immediately it was badly sprained, if not broken. I dragged myself against the ravine wall, trying to find somewhere to hide, somewhere it couldn't reach me. That's when I found the old mine shaft. It was barely visible, partially collapsed, and nearly hidden by decades of erosion and fallen rock. But there was an opening, just large enough for me to squeeze through. I pulled myself inside, ignoring the screaming pain from my ankle, and crawled back into the darkness as far as I could. I could hear it at the entrance, trying to force its way in. The opening was too narrow for its massive shoulders. It clawed at the rock, and I could hear stone breaking away. It was trying to dig its way into me. I sat in that absolute darkness, pressed against the back wall of the mine shaft, listening to it tear at the entrance. Hours passed. Sometimes the digging would stop, and I'd hear it pacing outside, waiting. When dawn came, the noises finally ceased. I waited another hour, terrified it was a trick, before I crawled back toward the entrance. Sunlight streamed through the opening, which was now significantly larger from its efforts during the night. I could see deep gouge marks in the rock where its claws had torn away stone. I pulled myself out into the morning light. My ankle was swollen and useless. I had no water, no food, no supplies. I was lost somewhere in the West Texas desert with at least 2 of those things hunting me. I spent that day hobbling through the desert, using a branch as a makeshift crutch, driven by the knowledge that if I stayed still, they'd find me again when night came. The sun was merciless, and dehydration began to set in. By afternoon, I was hallucinating, seeing water where there was none, hearing voices in the wind. I nearly died that day. I know I should have, but somehow in the late afternoon, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Not much of one, barely 2 tracks in the sand, but it meant people sometimes came this way. I followed it, dragging my injured leg, my vision blurring. I don't remember much of the next few hours. Scattered images, the sun setting, sitting down because I couldn't walk anymore. Darkness coming, that howl in the distance, and my complete inability to even care anymore because I was so far past exhausted. The rancher found me the next morning. He'd been checking fence lines in his truck and saw what he thought was a dead body on the road. He told me later that I was delirious, talking about monsters and caves and begging him to not let them get me. He got me to a hospital in the nearest town. Severe dehydration, 2nd-degree burns from sun exposure, badly sprained ankle, various cuts and bruises. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. When I was coherent enough, I tried to tell them what happened. They exchanged glances and suggested the dehydration had caused hallucinations. The police went out to the area I described, but they never found the drilling site or my truck. They said I must have been confused about the location. The petroleum company sent their own people, and they couldn't find the site either. My supervisor suggested maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the isolation and heat got to me. They all wanted to believe I imagined it. It was easier than the alternative. But I know what I saw. I know what hunted me through that desert. And I know that whatever those things are, they're still out there. I haven't been able to return to work. Every night I wake up at 3 a.m., hearing that scraping sound in my dreams. I've moved to El Paso and as far from remote desert sites as I can get while staying in Texas. But I know distance doesn't matter, not really. Because 2 weeks ago, I woke at 3 a.m. to that scraping sound again. Not in my dreams. Outside my apartment window, on the third floor, and when I looked out, I saw tracks in the dirt of the flower bed below. Massive tracks with distinct claw marks. It found me. They always do.